Hey guys, welcome to Disciple Dojo. And in this video, we're going to be looking at a book that I just got, and that is the 75th anniversary edition, the one-volume edition of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. I'm just going to show you real quick what this is and give you a little bit of background, and I'm going to tell you why this is my favorite thing of everything C.S. Lewis ever wrote. This is number one at the top of my list. Now, this was published back in 2013. 2013 was actually the 75-year anniversary. And I read a lot. This went under my radar. I already have copies of all three of the books that make this up, the paperbacks, including the paperback set that came out, the ones with the really colorful colors. This is the first two volumes. I actually don't have volume 3 in this set. I have the audio versions on Audible. And this is cool. One of our viewers who is in ministry had a church member who passed away, and he got some of the things in his library. And one of the things that was in that library was this church member was a serviceman during World War II. And this is the first edition, American, not the British first edition, but the first American printing of Perelandra, which is number 2 in the Space Trilogy. And so it's dated July 12th, 1945. And it's got the imprint letting you know that this was a wartime book. If you've seen our Disciple Dojo t-shirt here, Books or Weapons in the War of Ideas, that's an adaptation of this logo that was, books printed during war when things were scarce. But people also needed art and literature, and they needed to know what they were fighting for. So this is just a real, what I would like to find is a facsimile, a reproduction of the original dust jacket. So I found one online, but it was like $25. The guy wouldn't give me a digital scan of it, so I could just get printed here. I was going to buy a digital copy from him, but he was like, no, I'm only sell you the actual thing, and it would be more for shipping. And I didn't get a good vibe from him. But if anybody knows where I can find, or if you have a digital scan of the original American dust jacket for Perelandra that I could put on this old water damaged copy that a World War II veteran church member that was in his library that's now in my library, man, that would just be awesome. And I'm totally happy to pay for it. So I already have it. Why did I get the one volume edition? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The volumes that I have are paperback, except for that first printing, which means that it's not the best paper quality, and they don't hold up as well. So I got this copy because I wanted a hardback. I wanted them all in one place, and I wanted to be able to take notes in the margins. I wanted to be able to mark them up and, write notes and make observations. And that's just hard to do in little handheld paperbacks. Now, honestly, the quality of this print is by HarperCollins. It's not the best quality. The binding is kind of loose, a little bit wonky. The pages are already separate. I mean, it came like this. The pages are already separated. It's got some dings and scratches on. I didn't buy it used. I bought it new from Amazon, but I don't know. I think they threw it from across the factory into the box because it's all scuffed up. And so anyway, it's not the best copy, but I think that's fine. It still serves its purpose. If you know of a better quality version, not an heirloom or premium version, but maybe like a nice one volume printing of the Space Trilogy, let me know. I'd love to see, even if it's out of print or if it's a little more rare, it would just be something I'd be interested in knowing about because, like I said, this is my favorite of all Lewis's works. So I want to show you a couple of, there's not a lot in this. I mean, it's just basically the books. I wish there were, annotations and extra material. There's not, but there is something cool in the forward and the afterward, and I'm going to share that with you. And then I'm going to read the passage I read in this book as a high school kid that just sucked me in, and I never looked back. So here's what it looks like. It's a nice design. It's a matte finish, not a gloss finish. So the Space Trilogy is 3 books. It's Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. Those are the 3 volumes of the Space Trilogy. Sometimes you'll see it called the Ransom Trilogy. That's because Ransom is the name of the main character, the protagonist. And he was modeled after, of all people, J.R. Tolkien. And in the beginning, there's a foreword by Tolkien. And this is so cool. Just imagine C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, their buddies sitting around in a pub. I think it was called the Eagle and Child Pub over in Oxford, and just reading stories to each other or poems to each other, things that they liked, things that they had written, things that they thought was cool. Just, man, I can't imagine having that type of regular community. It's a rare gift. I so wish I had that, like a modern version of the Inklings. And so Tolkien writes in this, he says, Mr. C.S. Lewis tells me that you have allowed him to submit to you out of the Silent Planet. So this is the forward of the first book. Look what Tolkien says. I read it, of course, and I've since heard it pass a rather different test, that of being read aloud to our local club, which goes in for reading things short and long aloud. How cool is that? Just a club where they sit and read each other's stuff and kick it back and forth. That's awesome. And he's talking about the Inklings. It proved an exciting serial and was highly approved. But of course, we're all rather like-minded. This is J.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, is saying this. And then he says, it's only by an odd accident that the hero is a philologist, one point in which he resembles me. It's not an odd accident. Lewis did it intentionally. We originally meant each to write an excursionary thriller, a space journey, his, and a time journey, mine, each discovering myth. So the idea was they wanted to write thriller stories, like exciting stories, one about somebody traveling in space, one about somebody traveling through time. But the focus of it would be to unpack, to discover what they considered like echoes of God, the mythos that are found in all the cultures and all the histories of the world, how they kind of permeate. And for Tolkien and Lewis, those were very much pointers to a greater reality, which of course they both believed was the gospel itself. Lewis a Protestant, Tolkien a Catholic. And so Tolkien goes on, I read this story in the original manuscript and was so enthralled that I could do nothing until I finished it. My first criticism was simply that it was too short. I still think that criticism holds. And he goes on to say, the story had for the more intelligent reader a great number of philosophical and mythical implications that enormously enhanced without detracting from the surface adventure. So he's like, you can just appreciate this as an adventure story, but for the intelligent reader, there are depths to plumb in this story. And he notes there's also a spice of satire on other superficially similar works of, quote, scientific fiction, such as the reference to the notion that higher intelligence will inevitably be combined with ruthlessness. And this is kind of a shot across the bow at H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds and that kind of thing. Lewis intentionally wrote this as an alternative to H.G. Wells' type of science fiction. And he concludes, I, at any rate, should have bought this story at almost any price if I had found it in print, and loudly recommended it as a thriller by an intelligent man. But I know only too sadly from my efforts to find anything to read, even with an, quote, on-demand subscription at a library, that my taste is not normal. J.R.R. Tolkien, 1938. And then in the preface at the beginning, Lewis, just right at the front, he notes, because again, this was written as an alternative to H.G. Wells type science fiction, like a Darwinistic, materialistic, evolutionary, naturalistic science fiction. Lewis says, certain slighting references to earlier stories of this type, which will be found in the following pages, have been put there for purely dramatic purposes. The author would be sorry if any reader supposed he was too stupid to have enjoyed Mr. H.G. Wells's fantasies or too ungrateful to acknowledge his debt to them. So Lewis did praise Wells. Even though he vehemently disagreed with the worldview in Wells's stories, he still recognized his legitimate genius. Then at the very end, there's an afterword written by Tolkien, and this was decades later, 1967. And Tolkien says, the unpayable debt that I owe to him was not influence, as it's ordinarily understood, but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. You have C.S. Lewis to thank for The Lord of the Rings, fantasy fans. He says, we neither of us expected much success as amateurs, and actually Lewis had some difficulty in getting Out of the Silent Planet published. And after all that has happened since, the most lasting pleasure and reward for both of us has been that we provided one another with stories to hear or read that we really liked in large parts. Like, what higher praise could there be than to have J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who almost single-handedly created the modern fantasy genre to shower upon a story. And that's why, to me, it's just so criminal that Lewis's space trilogy has been so largely neglected, particularly by Christian readers. You know, everybody knows Lewis for Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, and the Narnia Chronicles. And those are phenomenal works. I love all of those. But so many people don't even realize that he wrote an entire science fiction trilogy. And it was steeped in exploring theological and philosophical themes that were found not only in the biblical text, but also in world literature. There's echoes of everything from Virgil to Homer to Dante to British lore about Merlin and King Arthur. It really is I consider this Lewis's best fiction. And I say that as someone who loves Narnia and Screwtape. Now I'm going to read an excerpt from Out of the Silent Planet in just a second to kind of give you a taste of it if this is completely new and you've never even heard of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. But for those of you who have, and that's probably a lot of you who clicked on this video, you probably at least heard of these books. Maybe you read them back in high school or college or something. There is a book called Planets in Peril, a critical study of C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. This is by David C. Downing. It's published by the University of Massachusetts Press. This book is wonderful. If you're a fan of Lewis's space trilogy, this is like having, so we review study Bibles here on the channel. This is like the study Bible notes to the text of Lewis's space trilogy. Introductory essays, pointing out things where there's allusions you might have missed, the cohesive worldview that binds together not just the space trilogy, but the space trilogy is actually tied intricately into the Narnia series. And all of it has to do with the medieval view of astronomy. Lewis wrote before the space race. Before humanity had ever gone into outer space, Lewis was writing about outer space, and he was pulling from the deep medieval mythology and astronomy that assigned levels to the heavens and the different gods, Greco-Roman gods that were related to each of the planets. And by planets, he means astral bodies, because that would include the sun and the moon. So the things that move in the sky, not the stars. And that each of the known ones at the time, because not all of them had even been discovered yet, they were related to different characteristics in ancient mythology. And Lewis has woven those in, particularly in the space trilogy, but also in the Narnia Chronicles. Each of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia is tied to a different one of the 7 planets in the medieval scheme. And I'll link, I mean, there's a number of explorations of this topic online, but I'll put a link to one that I came across that's very helpful in unpacking it and showing you, oh, wow, this is the key that kind of unlocks. Like, why did Lewis have Santa Claus in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It wasn't accidental, and it wasn't just to tick off J.R.R. Tolkien. There was a reason for it, just as there were for all of the other volumes in Narnia. So that's a whole different area in and of itself. But in the space trilogy, it also incorporates this medieval mindset of the planets and astronomy. And so that's what Downing unpacks in this work. And he also gives a really good bibliography. So there's only 7 chapters. At the back, there's a bibliography that's about 11 pages long, covering Lewis's different works. And there's also a topical index. But Downing gives some background in the introduction to the space trilogy, which he calls the Ransom Trilogy. And he talks about the paradoxical nature of Lewis. He says, Lewis as a writer of fiction is no less enigmatic. He did not marry until his late 50s, gives some of us hope, and had no children of his own. It is generally reported that he was uncomfortable around children. Yet his Chronicles of Narnia are acknowledged as classics of children's literature, continuing to sell 1 million copies a year. His Ransom Trilogy was written as, quote, holiday fiction, and he wrote only one handwritten draft of each fantasy, with just a few minor revisions before sending them off to the publisher. Lewis hand-wrote the Space Trilogy in a single draft, a couple of revisions, and then here you go, publish this. That's unbelievable. And then the first chapter, which is about Lewis's own, how he looks at his early life. Downing says, in Lewis, we find a writer of almost bewildering diversity. The medieval historian who wrote letters to children, the literary critic who wrote interplanetary romances, the Christian apologist who composed humorous light verse. Yet one always senses in Lewis' books, quote, the one in the many. His singular way of looking at things, his characteristic habits of thought and speech developed early in his life and remained remarkably constant. So there's a fascinating interconnectedness in all the books Lewis wrote. Reading any one of them casts light upon all the others. And then Lewis came from a background in materialism. You know, he was a skeptic before his conversion to Christianity. He just accepted naturalism, the natural world. And even after he became a Christian, Lewis still accepted things like an old earth and theistic evolution. Like anybody that says you can't be a Christian and believe in evolution is clearly wrong. You can be one of the greatest Christian authors that ever lived and believe in some form of evolution, which Lewis did. But what he railed against, and what the entire Ransom series is a tour de force argument against, is the naturalistic view of the universe. He wrote an essay called Shelley, Dryden, and Mr. Eliot, and he kind of critiqued some of these modern trends that he was seeing as a literary critic. And he said, men, and still more boys, like to call themselves disillusioned because the very form of the word suggests that they have had the illusions and emerged from them, have tried both worlds. The claim, however, is false in 9 cases out of 10. The world is full of impostors who claim to be disenchanted and are really unenchanted. Mere natural men who have never risen so high as to be in danger of the generous illusions they claim to have escaped from. They talk like sages who have passed through the half-truths of humanitarian benevolence, aristocratic honor, or romantic passion, while in fact they are clods who have never yet advanced so far. I mean, there should just be like a picture of Richard Dawkins' face right here in the book, because that's exactly the worldview that he's talking about. Just the pretentiousness of naturalism that claims to have moved beyond all of the naive or fantasy, romantic, mystical, just the, oh yeah, they are the ones that have the truth. Lewis was like, they have no idea. So like, talk about shots fired. And this really comes out. I mean, you see this at the end of Out of the Silent Planet. This is dealt with at the end of that book. And then the entire book, That Hideous Strength, the 3rd volume in the series, the entire book is aimed squarely at bringing this view to light and showing the hollowness of it. And then there's a great line that Downing has about why Lewis wrote science fiction. He wasn't a science fiction writer, and his background was, medieval poetry and mythology and literature. He was a literary critic. So why would he choose science fiction? And Downing says, apart from debunking evolutionism, and again, Lewis believed in a form of evolution. It's capital E, evolutionism, the idea that it is a naturalistic Darwinian process that has no room for any supernatural or wonder or mysticism, any of that stuff. That's what he means by evolutionism. So apart from debunking evolutionism, Lewis also hoped that taking his readers on an imaginative voyage to another world would give them a new perspective on this one. And I'm going to tell you, it absolutely did that. As a teenager reading this, a 16-year-old reading this in I think I was in 10th grade, might have been 9th grade. I saw the world differently after reading Out of the Silent Planet. And then a couple of years later, I got a copy of Perelandra in college, and it blew me away even more. I mean, to this day, Perelandra is like in my top 3. I go back and forth. My favorite novel of all time is Watership Down, but Perelandra is, some days Perelandra is my favorite novel of all time. And so those two kind of go back and forth. But if you've never read the book, what I want to do, I just want to read a section from one of the early chapters. There's not going to be any spoilers. And this is one of the early chapters of the first book, Out of the Silent Planet. Now remember, this was written before space travel was a thing. This was written before, I don't even think rocketry was in its infancy. Like shooting missiles, that was in its infancy. So the idea of traveling in space, completely unknown. This was in the years leading up to World War II, after the horrors of World War I that both Lewis and Tolkien had seen firsthand as soldiers. And so all of that to say, so the story begins with a philologist. A philologist is a professor who studies words, basically a linguist. And he's just on a walking holiday, a walking tour, walking through the countryside. And a storm blows up, it starts to rain, and it's getting dark, and he has to take shelter. And so he takes shelter in this like little cottage. And in the cottage, he ends up coming across 2 people who it's a little uncertain what their motives are at first, but one of them he knows. One of them is a colleague of his, an academic colleague. And so the two guys, Weston and Devine, those are the two in the cottage, and they talk to him and they catch up he catches up. One, he doesn't have a good feeling about one of them. The other, they were never like BFFs, but they were colleagues. They had a cordial, but maybe somewhat cold relationship. And Ransom just never had a real bead on this guy. So anyway, they talk for a while. They end up drugging him, like roofing him with some wine. And he hears this kind of discussion. There was this boy, this just kind of farm boy that they had planned on doing something with, but you don't really know what. And then he's kind of hearing them in this while he's out of it. And he's hearing like phrases of them talking about doing it with him instead. And so when Ransom gets a chance, he wakes up and he like gets ready to dash out the door. He opens the door and then he gets hit on the back of the head and everything goes dark. So this is all in just the first 2 chapters. And then in chapter 3 is great. He wakes up and he's in this room and it's a weird room. He looks out and he sees the moon is just incredible. I mean, it's super bright. It says it's like a huge football, a soccer ball. It's blinding. It seems like it's just outside the glass. Like the moon is not that big. The moon should not be that big. And so he thinks something's wrong with his eyes. And then he starts to look around at the room. And just listen to this section. This is one of my favorite descriptions and aha moments certainly in this trilogy, but in all of literature. It says, the light of the huge moon, if it was a moon, had by now illuminated his surroundings almost as clearly as if they were day. It was a very strange room. The floor was so small that the bed and a table beside it occupied the whole width of it. The ceiling seemed to be nearly twice as wide, and the walls sloped outward as they rose, so that Ransom had the impression of lying at the bottom of a deep and narrow wheelbarrow. This confirmed his belief that his sight was either temporarily or permanently injured. In other respects, however, he was recovering rapidly and even beginning to feel an unnatural lightness of heart and a not disagreeable excitement. The heat was still oppressive, and he stripped off everything but his shirt and trousers before rising to explore. His rising was disastrous and raised graver apprehensions in his mind about the effects of being drugged. Although he had been conscious of no unusual muscular effort, he found himself leaping from the bed with an energy which brought his head into sharp contact with the skylight and flung him down again in a heap on the floor. He found himself on the other side against the wall that ought to have sloped outwards, like the side of a wheelbarrow according to his previous reconnaissance, but it didn't. He felt it and looked at it. It was unmistakably at right angles to the floor. More cautiously this time, he rose again to his feet. He felt an extraordinary lightness of body, and it was with difficulty that he kept his feet on the floor. For the first time, a suspicion that he might be dead and already in the ghost life crossed his mind. He was trembling, but 100 mental habits forbade him to consider this possibility. Instead, he explored his prison. The result was beyond doubt. All the walls looked as if they sloped outwards so as to make the room wider at the ceiling than it was at the floor. But each wall, as you stood beside it, turned out to be perfectly perpendicular, not only to the sight, but to the touch. Also, if one stooped down and examined with one's fingers the angle between it and the floor, the same examination revealed 2 other curious facts. The room was walled and floored with metal and was in a state of continuous faint vibration, a silent vibration with a strangely lifelike and unmechanical quality about it. But if the vibration was silent, there was plenty of noise going on, a series of musical raps or percussions at quite irregular intervals, which seemed to come from the ceiling. It was as if the metal chamber in which he found himself was being bombarded with small tinkling missiles. Ransom was by now thoroughly frightened, not with the prosaic fright that a man suffers in a war, but with a heady, bounding kind of fear that was hardly distinguishable from his general excitement. He was poised on a sort of emotional watershed from which he felt he might at any moment pass either into delirious terror or into an ecstasy of joy. He knew now that he was not in a submarine, and the infinitesimal quivering of the metal did not suggest the motion of any wheeled vehicle. A ship, then, he supposed, or some kind of airship? But there was an oddity in all his sensations for which neither supposition accounted. Puzzled, he sat down again on the bed and stared at the pretentious moon. An airship, some kind of flying machine. But why did the moon look so big? It was larger than he had thought at first. No moon could really be that size. And then he realized now that he had known this from the first, but had repressed the knowledge through terror. At the same moment, a thought came into his head which stopped his breath. There could be no full moon at all that night. He remembered distinctly that he had walked from Natterby on a moonless night. Even if the thin crescent of a new moon had escaped his notice, it could not have grown to this in a few hours. It could not have grown to this at all, this megalomaniacal disk, far larger than a football he had at first compared it to, larger than a child's hoop, filling almost half the sky. And where was the old man in the moon, the familiar face that had looked down on all the generations of men? The thing wasn't the moon at all, and he felt his hair move on his scalp. At that moment, the sound of an opening door made him turn his head. An oblong of dazzling light appeared behind him and instantly vanished as the door closed again, having emitted the bulky form of a naked man whom Ransom recognized as Weston. No reproach, no demand for an explanation rose from Ransom's lips or even to his mind, not with that monstrous orb above them. The mere presence of a human being with its offer of at least some companionship broke down the tension in which his nerves had long been resisting a bottomless dismay. He found, when he spoke, that he was sobbing. "Weston, Weston," he gasped. "What is it? It's not the moon, not that size. It can't be, can it?" "No," Weston replied. "It's the earth." And that's the end of chapter 3. The book is so stinking good, and it only gets better. Ransom ends up being taken to another planet. I'm not going to give any spoilers. In the second volume, we encounter Ransom again. Ransom is, in the second one, sent to another planet. And then in the third volume, Ransom is not the main character. He's the auxiliary character. The third one follows a couple at a university, an academic setting in England. And in each of them, there is an opposition element. We'll just say that. In each story, there is something that the protagonist, Ransom in the first two and the couple in the second two, are meant to encounter, experience, and ultimately overcome. But the thing that makes the Space Trilogy so different is it deals with the question of, if we met extraterrestrials, what would their beliefs be? What would their worldview be? What would they make of the concept of God, devils, angels, Jesus? And that's where the Space Trilogy shines. The last couple of chapters of Out of the Silent Planet, like I said, when I read it, boom, just floored me. And then Paralandra, we've done a video here in our Pages from Sages series where I read an excerpt from Paralandra, and it talks about like righteous hatred, meeting the thing for which hatred is the correct response. And again, like I said, I don't want to give any spoilers, but all that to say, if you haven't read Lewis's Space Trilogy, you are missing out on what I think is some of the finest fictional literature of the 20th century, and possibly of all time. This is Lewis's most underrated work, I think, but I really do think it's his best work. I know some Lewis snobs say Till We Have Faces, that's his best work, and I've read that. I probably need to read it again. It didn't grab me the way this did, but I'm also, you can tell, I'm a science fiction, adventure, fantasy, imaginative nerd, and I love all that stuff. So I think that's probably a big part of why this grabbed me when I first read it way back in high school. So check it out. I would love to hear your comments. Those of you that have read the Space Trilogy, let me know what you think. If you think other people should read it as well, tell them why in the comments section. Which is your favorite of the 3 volumes? Mine is Paralandra. I think the other 2 are excellent. I think Paralandra and Out of the Silent Planet, I would put That Hideous Strength as my 3rd favorite of the trilogy, but I know other people completely differ with that judgment. So share yours in the comments below. And yeah, like I said, if you know of another 1-volume edition of the Space Trilogy, preferably if it's annotated, I've yet to come across an annotated version, that'd be amazing. I would love an academic annotated version of the Space Trilogy, 1 volume. That'd be awesome. And check out Downing's book, Planets in Peril. It's so, so good. There is another book. I didn't mention it because I don't have a print copy. I actually listened to it on Audible, but it's called Planet Narnia by Michael Ward, The 7 Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And it unpacks, for the Narnia Chronicles, the medieval view of the planets and how Lewis has embedded those. And Ward has I think he's persuasively argued like Lewis intentionally left a lot of clues and codes and things in his work because he wanted guys like his friends in the Inklings. You know, he wanted the J.R.R. Tolkiens and the others to be able to find these little breadcrumbs of interesting things that would ultimately make sense in light of the whole. And I think Ward has done a brilliant job of showing that that's what he's doing in the 7 Narnia Chronicles. And Downing, of course, shows how he does it through the Space Trilogy. So check those out. I highly recommend them. But that'll do for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. In the meantime, as always, keep training.